She walked into a place where everyone silently decided she didn't belong. No arguments, no drama, just judgment. Stay until the end. This story will change how you see dignity and respect. Like the video and subscribe for more real stories. The private medical clinic stood just a few blocks away from the ocean in Miami, a building of glass and white stone that reflected sunlight so brightly it almost hurt to look at. Palm trees lined the entrance, perfectly trimmed, their shadows falling neatly across the marble steps. Inside, the air was cool, quiet, and smelled faintly of antiseptic and expensive perfume. Soft instrumental music played from hidden speakers, barely audible, designed to calm people who could afford not to be in a hurry. This was not a place for emergencies. It was a place for people who expected comfort, speed, and respect as part of the service they paid for. The waiting area looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a medical facility. Deep brown leather armchairs were arranged with careful symmetry. A glass table held neatly stacked magazines that no one ever seemed to read. Along one wall hung framed photographs of smiling doctors, modern equipment, and plaques engraved with the names of donors. Most of the people sitting there looked as if they belonged in those frames. Men in tailored suits checked their phones. Women in elegant dresses spoke quietly or stared out at the sunlight beyond the windows. Everything about the space communicated the same unspoken message. This place was exclusive. The automatic doors opened with a soft hiss, and an elderly woman stepped inside. Her name was Eleanor Brooks. She was 88 years old. She paused just inside the entrance, allowing the doors to close behind her before she moved any farther. She stood still for a moment, her hand resting on the handle of her wooden cane, as if she were letting her eyes adjust not to the light, but to the atmosphere. Her hair was neatly combed back and streaked with silver. She wore a simple, light-colored cardigan over a modest blouse and a long skirt that had clearly been worn many times before, but was clean and carefully pressed. Her shoes were sensible, flat, and old. Nothing about her appearance was flashy. Nothing about it demanded attention. And yet, attention found her anyway. A few heads turned. Some people looked at her briefly and then looked away. Others stared a second longer, their expressions shifting with curiosity or quiet judgment. Eleanor felt those looks the way she had felt them her entire life. They were familiar. She did not flinch. She did not rush. She took a slow step forward, then another, the soft tap of her cane echoing faintly against the polished floor. At the far end of the lobby stood the reception desk, sleek and white, with a young woman seated behind it. The receptionist's posture was straight, her makeup flawless, her expression neutral in the practiced way of someone trained to be polite without being warm. Eleanor walked toward the desk, aware of the contrast between herself and the space around her, but not intimidated by it. "Good morning," Eleanor said when she reached the counter. Her voice was calm, steady, and low. "I have an appointment today. I just wanted to confirm that it's still scheduled." The receptionist looked up. Her eyes moved quickly over Eleanor's face, then down to her clothes, then back to her face again. The look was subtle, but it was there. Eleanor had seen it thousands of times before. The receptionist did not smile. "Name?" the woman asked, her tone flat. "Brooks," Eleanor replied. "Eleanor Brooks." The receptionist turned to her computer and began typing, her long fingernails clicking softly against the keyboard. Eleanor waited, her hands folded loosely over the handle of her cane. Around them, conversations continued in low murmurs, but she could feel a few people listening more closely now. After a moment, the receptionist stopped typing. She frowned slightly at the screen. "This clinic is private," the receptionist said without looking up. "All consultations here are paid in full. We don't accept standard insurance." "I understand," Eleanor said. "I'm aware of the cost." The receptionist finally looked up again, this time with a trace of impatience in her eyes. "Consultations start at $2,000, she added, as if repeating the number might change something. "Payment is required before the appointment." Eleanor nodded once. "Yes," she said simply. "That's fine." There was a brief pause. The receptionist's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. as if the conversation was not following the path she had expected. She leaned back slightly in her chair. "Ma'am," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound professional, "this is a high-end facility. Many of our patients wait months for availability. If there's been some kind of misunderstanding, you might be more comfortable at a community clinic. There are several nearby." The words were polite. The meaning was not. Eleanor felt the eyes of the waiting room shift again. Someone cleared their throat. A woman across the room glanced at Eleanor's shoes and then quickly looked away. Eleanor remained still. Her face showed no anger, no embarrassment, only quiet attention. "I didn't ask where I would be more comfortable," Eleanor said. Her voice did not rise. "I asked whether my appointment was confirmed." The receptionist sighed softly, the sound barely audible but unmistakably dismissive. She turned back to the screen. "One moment," she said. Eleanor stood there waiting, the weight of years pressing gently but firmly against her spine. She thought of other rooms, other counters, other voices that had spoken to her in the same tone. Grocery stores, offices, schools, hospitals. The details were different, but the feeling was always the same. Being measured, being judged, being found lacking before she had said anything at all. Behind the desk, the receptionist continued to scroll through the system, her eyebrows slowly drawing together. The silence stretched. Eleanor could feel something shifting, though she did not yet know what it was. She only knew that the moment was not over. The receptionist stopped typing. She stared at the screen. Then she looked up at Eleanor again, this time with a different expression entirely. The receptionist remained silent for several seconds, her eyes fixed on the computer screen, as if it might suddenly change what it was showing her. Eleanor stood patiently on the other side of the desk, her posture relaxed but upright, her hands still resting on her cane. The quiet between them grew uncomfortable, stretching just long enough for people in the waiting room to notice that something was off. A man in a gray suit shifted in his chair. A woman near the window stopped scrolling on her phone and glanced toward the desk. Finally, the receptionist cleared her throat and straightened her shoulders, as though regaining control of the situation. "Just a moment," she said again, this time more sharply, and began clicking through different tabs on the screen. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than arguments ever could. After another pause, the receptionist looked up. Her voice, however, returned to its earlier tone, cool and dismissive, as if whatever she had seen did not matter. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, emphasizing the name in a way that felt oddly distant. "Our system shows an appointment under that name, but I don't see a payment authorization attached." "That's correct," Eleanor replied calmly. "I usually take care of that in person." The receptionist exhaled through her nose, clearly irritated. "As I explained," she said, "we require advance payment. This clinic isn't like a regular hospital. We don't operate on walk-in arrangements or special exceptions." "I'm not asking for an exception," Eleanor said. "I'm asking to proceed as scheduled." The receptionist tilted her head slightly and folded her hands on the desk. "With all due respect, ma'am," she said, her voice lowering just enough to sound condescending rather than openly rude, "this facility serves a very specific clientele. Many of our patients are referred through private networks. If you're concerned about cost or procedure, the City Medical Center can help you without the same financial pressure." A quiet ripple of reaction passed through the room. Someone coughed. Another person chuckled softly, quickly stifling the sound when a companion nudged them. Eleanor felt none of it physically, but she was aware of every movement, every shift of air. This was the familiar moment, the one she recognized instantly, the moment when politeness was used as a shield for judgment. "I am not concerned about the cost," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady but firmer now. "And I am exactly where I intend to be." The receptionist raised her eyebrows slightly, as if surprised by the response. "Ma'am," she said, leaning forward, "I'm trying to help you avoid an uncomfortable situation. These appointments are expensive, and we can't hold a slot for someone who isn't prepared." Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "I've been prepared my entire life," she said quietly. The receptionist paused, then gave a small, humorless smile. "Very well," she said. "Then I'll need to see a valid payment method before we go any further." Eleanor nodded and reached into her bag. The movement drew even more attention now. Several people watched openly. A woman in a cream-colored dress leaned slightly toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand. Eleanor removed a simple card holder and placed a single card gently on the counter. The receptionist picked it up, glanced at it, and frowned. "This isn't one of our preferred cards," she said. "We usually work with private accounts." "It's sufficient," Eleanor replied. The receptionist hesitated, then turned back to the computer and began typing again. Her fingers moved faster this time, her lips pressing into a thin line. Eleanor could see the tension growing, the impatience. It reminded her of classrooms long ago, of administrators who had assumed she was there by mistake, of meetings where her presence had been questioned before her words ever were. Behind her, the waiting room had grown quieter. People sensed a confrontation even if they didn't understand it. Eleanor felt the weight of their curiosity, their assumptions. She had lived with that weight for decades. It had never crushed her. If anything, it had shaped her. The receptionist suddenly stopped typing. She leaned closer to the screen, then sat back abruptly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight. "I need to get my supervisor." Before Eleanor could respond, the receptionist stood and walked quickly through a side door behind the desk. A low murmur spread across the waiting room. Eleanor remained where she was, her expression unchanged. She did not feel nervous. She felt something else instead, something quieter and deeper. Recognition. She had seen this pattern before. The initial dismissal, the subtle humiliation, the attempt to redirect her elsewhere. And then, always, the moment when the truth forced its way to the surface. As she waited, Eleanor's mind drifted briefly to earlier years, to long days spent working while others overlooked her, to nights spent planning, saving, choosing discipline over resentment. She thought of how often she had been told she didn't belong, and how often she had simply stayed anyway. The side door opened again. The receptionist returned, followed by a tall man in a navy suit. His hair was neatly combed, his expression professional but alert. He scanned the room quickly before his eyes landed on Eleanor. "Good morning," he said, stepping forward. "I'm Richard Hampton. I manage operations here. Is there a problem?" The receptionist spoke quickly, almost defensively. "There's confusion about an appointment and payment," she said. "I was just explaining our policies." Richard glanced at the computer screen, then back at Eleanor. His expression shifted slightly, though he tried to hide it. "Mrs. Brooks," he said slowly, reading the name again. "May I ask how I can assist you?" Eleanor met his gaze. "I'm here for my appointment," she said. "I was told there might be a problem." Richard studied her for a moment longer than necessary. He seemed uncertain, caught between procedure and something he had not expected. The room was silent now. No one pretended not to watch. "I see," he said at last. "Please give me just a moment." He leaned toward the receptionist's screen, his face growing more serious as he read. Eleanor noticed the subtle change in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened. Whatever he was seeing, it was not aligning with the assumptions made just minutes earlier. The receptionist watched him nervously. Richard straightened. "I'll take care of this," he said quietly. Eleanor felt the air in the room shift again. She did not yet know why, but she knew this moment was no longer about inconvenience. Something was beginning to surface, something that would not fit neatly back into silence. She remained standing at the desk, calm and unmoving, as the foundations of the room's judgment began, slowly, to crack. Richard Hampton did not speak right away. He remained standing beside the reception desk, his eyes fixed on the screen, scrolling slowly as if he needed to confirm what he was seeing more than once. The receptionist stood stiffly beside him now, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by visible tension. Eleanor watched them both without expression, her breathing calm, her presence steady. After a few seconds that felt much longer to everyone in the room, Richard straightened fully and cleared his throat. The sound cut cleanly through the silence. "This is Brooks," he said, his voice noticeably different from before. It was lower now, controlled, respectful. "May I ask you to take a seat for just a moment?" Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "I'm quite comfortable standing," she replied. Richard nodded, accepting the response without question. He glanced briefly at the receptionist, then back at Eleanor. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding," he said carefully. A few people in the waiting area leaned forward in their chairs. Others froze mid-motion. No one spoke. Richard turned toward the receptionist. "Could you please step away from the desk for a moment?" The receptionist's face drained of color. "Yes, of course," she said quickly. She moved aside, leaving the space between Richard and Eleanor open and unobstructed. The change in body language was subtle but unmistakable. Authority had shifted. Richard took a small step closer to Eleanor, lowering his voice, though everyone could still hear him. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "I want to apologize for the inconvenience you've experienced this morning." Eleanor looked at him calmly. "An inconvenience," she repeated softly. Richard nodded once. "Yes," he said, "and one that shouldn't have happened." He turned slightly and addressed the room, his voice firm but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we'll need a few minutes to resolve an internal matter. Thank you for your patience." No one moved. No one objected. All eyes remained on Eleanor. Richard looked back at her. "Would you be willing to step into my office for a moment?" he asked. Eleanor considered this. She glanced briefly around the waiting room, meeting the eyes of a few people who quickly looked away. Then she returned her gaze to Richard. "No," she said gently. "We can speak right here." Richard hesitated, then nodded again. "Of course," he said. "That's perfectly fine." He turned to the receptionist. "Do you know who Mrs. Brooks is?" he asked. The receptionist swallowed hard. "She's listed as a donor," she said quietly. "Her name appears on the records." Richard did not look at her. "Not just a donor," he said. "Mrs. Eleanor Brooks is one of the primary contributors to this clinic's development. The cardiac wing, the outpatient research program, and several staff training initiatives exist because of her support." The words landed heavily. A woman near the window covered her mouth with her hand. A man in a tailored jacket shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The room seemed smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. Richard continued. "Mrs. Brooks's appointment has been confirmed for weeks," he said. "Her arrangements have always been handled in person, by request." The receptionist's shoulders slumped. I didn't know," she said weakly. Eleanor spoke before Richard could respond. "That's exactly the point," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried effortlessly through the space. "You didn't know," Eleanor continued. "And instead of asking, you decided." She turned her gaze slowly toward the waiting room. "You all decided," she added. No one met her eyes. Richard folded his hands in front of him. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "on behalf of the clinic, I offer my sincere apologies." Eleanor regarded him for a long moment. "I appreciate the apology," she said, "but apologies don't fix patterns." Richard nodded, acknowledging the truth of the statement. "If you'll allow me," he said, "I'd like to explain." Eleanor remained silent, inviting him to continue. "This clinic was built to provide exceptional care," Richard said. "But excellence means nothing if respect is selective. What happened here this morning falls short of our standards." Eleanor's eyes softened slightly, but her posture remained firm. "My husband," she said, her voice steady, "spent more than 40 years in operating rooms not unlike this one. He believed medicine was a service, not a privilege. When he passed, I continued that belief in the only way I knew how." Richard listened intently. "I've supported this clinic because I trusted it to treat people as patients, not profiles," Eleanor continued. "What I experienced today suggests that trust needs examination." The room was completely silent now. Even the faint background music seemed to fade. Richard took a breath. "You're right," he said, "and that responsibility is mine." He turned to the receptionist, his tone firm but controlled. "You should have asked questions instead of making assumptions," he said. "That is not a personal failing, it's a systemic one, and it will be addressed." The receptionist nodded, tears welling in her eyes, but she said nothing. Eleanor watched her for a moment, then returned her attention to Richard. "I didn't come here to be recognized," she said. "I came here to be treated." Richard inclined his head. "And you will be," he said, "immediately." He gestured toward the hallway leading to the consultation rooms. "Dr. Lewis is ready for you," he said, "and after your appointment, if you're willing, I'd like to speak with you further about how we ensure this never happens again." Eleanor considered this, then nodded once. "That would be acceptable," she said. As she turned to walk down the hallway, her cane tapping softly against the floor, the people in the waiting room shifted again. But this time, there were no smirks, no whispers. Only lowered eyes and quiet reflection. The receptionist watched Eleanor leave, her face pale, her earlier assumptions now exposed for what they were. Richard remained at the desk for a moment longer, looking around the room. "This clinic will do better," he said simply. And for the first time since Eleanor had entered the building, the room felt honest. She disappeared down the hallway, her back straight, her steps measured, leaving behind a silence filled not with judgment, but with realization. When Eleanor returned to the waiting area after her consultation, the atmosphere had changed so completely that it felt like an entirely different place. The same leather chairs stood in the same positions, the same sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows, and the same quiet music floated in the background, yet nothing felt the same. The people who had once glanced at her with judgment now avoided her eyes altogether. Some sat stiffly, others shifted uncomfortably, and a few pretended to be deeply absorbed in their phones. The silence was heavier than before, not empty but filled with unspoken awareness. Eleanor walked slowly toward the reception desk and stopped. She did not sit down. She did not look around to measure reactions. She stood exactly where she had stood earlier, her cane resting lightly against the counter, her posture calm and balanced. The receptionist, whose name badge read Kelly, noticed her immediately and straightened in her chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them together. Richard Hampton emerged from the hallway moments later. His expression was serious, thoughtful, and focused. He approached Eleanor with measured steps and spoke in a low, respectful tone. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "thank you for your patience. If you're willing, I'd like to address what happened this morning." Eleanor nodded. "I think that would be appropriate," she said. Richard turned slightly so that his voice would carry through the waiting room. "What occurred today," he began, "was not simply a misunderstanding. It was a failure of judgment, and more importantly, a failure of respect." Kelly's face flushed. She stared at the desk, unable to look up. Richard continued, "Our policies are designed to ensure efficiency, but efficiency must never replace humanity. When assumptions are made based on appearance, age, or perceived status, we fail the very people we are meant to serve." A man seated near the window lowered his head. A woman clasped her handbag tighter in her lap. Richard turned toward Kelly. "Kelly," he said, "your actions today were inappropriate. However, this situation did not arise from malice alone. It reflects a deeper issue in how we train and guide our staff." Kelly's voice shook as she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said. "I truly am. I didn't think. I judged instead of asking." Eleanor watched her closely. There was fear there and shame, but also something else. Recognition. Richard took a breath. "Under normal circumstances," he said, "this behavior would result in immediate termination." A collective tension rippled through the room. Eleanor lifted her hand slightly. "No," she said. The word was soft, but it carried authority. Richard turned to her, surprised. "No?" he repeated. "No," Eleanor said again. "I don't want her fired." Kelly looked up sharply, disbelief written across her face. Eleanor continued, her voice steady and composed. "If you fire her, she learns fear," Eleanor said. "If you teach her, she learns responsibility. There is a difference." The room was silent. "I've spent my life teaching," Eleanor went on, "and I've learned that people do not grow when they are simply punished. They grow when they are made to understand the impact of their actions." Richard considered her words carefully, then nodded. "Then we will do it your way," he said. He turned back to Kelly. "You will be placed on mandatory ethics and inclusion training," he said. "You will also spend time shadowing patient advocacy staff. This is not optional." Kelly nodded quickly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't waste this chance." Eleanor regarded her for a moment, then gave a small nod in return. "This lesson isn't just for her," Eleanor said, raising her voice slightly. "It's for everyone in this room." She looked slowly around the waiting area. No one interrupted her. No one looked away. "You don't know what someone has survived," she said. "You don't know what they've built, what they've lost, or what they carry quietly. When you reduce people to appearances, you miss the truth, and the truth always comes back to confront you." Her words settled heavily, not like an accusation, but like a mirror. Richard spoke again. "Effective immediately," he said, "we will be reviewing our intake procedures, our staff training, and our internal culture. Respect will not be conditional here." A few people nodded slowly, as if absorbing something they had never considered before. Eleanor turned slightly toward Richard. "That's a start," she said. "But systems don't change because of words alone. They change because people choose to be better." Richard met her gaze. "And we will," he said, "with your guidance if you're willing." Eleanor paused. For a brief moment, her expression softened, not with satisfaction, but with quiet resolve. "I didn't come here to seek control," she said. "I came here because I believe institutions can either harm or heal. I choose to help them heal." Richard inclined his head. "Then we would be honored to learn from you," he said. Around them, the waiting room felt different now. The earlier arrogance had drained away, replaced by discomfort, humility, and reflection. People shifted not out of boredom, but unease. They had witnessed something they could not forget. Eleanor picked up her bag and adjusted her grip on her cane. "I think we're finished here for today," she said. Richard nodded. "Yes," he replied. "And again, Mrs. Brooks, thank you." As Eleanor turned toward the exit, several people stood instinctively, unsure why they were doing so, only knowing that remaining seated felt wrong. No one laughed. No one whispered. The space was filled with something rare and fragile: accountability. Eleanor walked toward the doors at the same measured pace she had entered, her steps unhurried, her back straight. She did not look over her shoulder. She did not need to. Behind her, a system had been confronted, and for the first time, it had listened. Several months passed, and the clinic by the ocean no longer functioned the way it once had. The glass walls were the same, the palm trees still cast their orderly shadows across the entrance, and the leather chairs remained polished and carefully arranged. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Policies were rewritten quietly and thoroughly. Training sessions became mandatory, not as a formality, but as a requirement tied directly to performance and advancement. Employees learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions, to listen before deciding, and to treat every person who walked through the doors as a patient first, not a profile. The changes were not announced with banners or speeches. They unfolded steadily, deliberately, the way real change often does. Complaints dropped. Patient satisfaction rose. More people returned for follow-up visits, not because the equipment was newer or the lobby more impressive, but because they felt seen. Word spread in subtle ways, through conversations and recommendations, through the quiet confidence of people who felt respected. One bright morning, Eleanor Brooks returned to the clinic. This time, the automatic doors opened before she reached them. A staff member greeted her with a warm smile and addressed her by name without hesitation. No one stared. No one whispered. The receptionist on duty stood when Eleanor approached the desk, not out of fear, but out of professionalism. The moment passed without spectacle, exactly as it should have. Eleanor checked in, took a seat, and waited. She observed the room with the same calm awareness she always carried. She noticed the way the staff interacted with patients, how questions were asked gently, how explanations were offered without impatience. She did not smile broadly, but there was a quiet sense of acknowledgement in her eyes. This was what she had hoped for. Not recognition, but correction. After her appointment, Richard Hampton met her in a small conference room overlooking the ocean. Sunlight reflected off the water outside, casting soft movement across the walls. "We've made progress," Richard said, "but we're not finished." Eleanor nodded. "Institutions rarely are," she replied. Richard hesitated briefly before speaking again. "The board has been discussing a long-term role for you here," he said. "Not symbolic, active, advisory. We believe your perspective is essential." Eleanor considered this carefully. She did not answer right away. "I don't want a title," she said at last. "I want accountability." Richard smiled faintly. "That's exactly why we asked," he said. Eleanor agreed to serve in an advisory capacity, meeting regularly with leadership and staff. She asked direct questions. She listened closely. She challenged excuses and praised progress when it was earned. Her presence was firm, but never domineering. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Under her guidance, patient advocacy programs expanded. Community outreach increased. Training shifted from scripted responses to real conversations. The clinic became known not only for excellence in care, but for integrity in practice. Outside the clinic, Eleanor's life remained largely unchanged. She still lived simply. She still walked with her cane. She still preferred quiet mornings and unhurried afternoons. What changed was the reach of her influence, not because she sought it, but because others finally understood its value. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat in the small office the clinic had set aside for advisory meetings, she received a handwritten letter. It was from a young medical student who had benefited from a scholarship funded years earlier by Eleanor and her late husband. The letter spoke of long nights of study, of doubt, of perseverance, and of gratitude for someone who had believed without asking for recognition. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it with others she kept in a simple drawer. Each one represented a life redirected, a door opened, a future altered. These were the returns she valued most. The clinic continued to grow, not just in numbers, but in trust. Patients arrived with less apprehension. Staff worked with greater pride. Respect became part of the culture rather than a policy requirement. Eleanor visited regularly, not to oversee balances or approvals, but to observe, to listen, and occasionally to remind. "Care is not a favor," she once said during a training session. "It is a responsibility." The words stayed with people. Years later, long after the memory of that first tense morning had faded for most, the effects remained. The clinic stood as an example of what happens when dignity is treated as essential rather than optional. Eleanor's name appeared discreetly on a plaque near the entrance, not in large letters, not as a tribute, but as a reminder of values. On her 91st birthday, Eleanor walked through the lobby once more. Staff greeted her warmly. Patients smiled politely. No one stared. No one questioned her presence. She paused briefly near the entrance, resting her hand on her cane, and looked around. The space felt balanced now, honest. Eleanor did not consider what had happened there a victory. She considered it a correction. As she stepped back into the sunlight, the ocean breeze moving gently through the palms, she carried the same quiet truth she always had. Real power is not used to diminish others. Real success is not proven by titles or appearances. And real wealth is measured by how many people are treated with dignity when no one thinks it matters. Eleanor Brooks had never raised her voice. She had never demanded attention. She had simply refused to be invisible. And in doing so, she had changed everything. If this story made you think, support the channel, like and subscribe. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments.